everyone, it's Ian Norman from Lonely Speck, and today I want to talk about a special method of noise reduction image stacking for astrophotos. You may have seen one of my older tutorials on how to stack multiple images together in Adobe Photoshop. And one of the tools that I talk about in that particular tutorial is using the Photoshop Auto Align function. Since we're exposing a bunch of different images of the night sky, and the Earth is rotating during our exposures, the stars end up appearing to move across the sky for each consecutive exposure. So in order to properly stack the images to reduce noise, we first have to align all of the images to each other. And one of the questions that I get a lot from viewers in the comments or from readers who have sent me emails is what to do when the auto alignment function doesn't work. So I've pulled up some photos that I think will be a pretty good example of what to do when Photoshop fails to automatically align all of your exposures. So the image that you're looking at here is actually a final stack of 8 separate images that were shot on the Sony RX100III. And the RX100 is a point and shoot. It has a relatively small sensor, and for this particular image I actually shot at f2.8. And I stopped down to f2.8 intentionally to see if I could increase the sharpness of the image a little bit, but at the expense of extra noise in the individual exposures. So let's take a look at one of the original individual exposures. So if we take a closer look at this image, we can still see, a lot of detail in the galactic center, but a lot of it's kind of muddied up by all of this noise. And one of the other things that I want to point out is just how much cloud cover there is. So if I scroll through this relatively quickly, you can see that we have the clouds moving in one direction and the stars wanting to move in another direction. So Photoshop will likely have difficulty aligning those images because it won't know whether it should be aligning the clouds or whether it should be aligning the galactic center. So that's one of the problems that we're going to learn how to work around in this tutorial. So I took a total of 8 separate exposures for this particular stack. I think 8 is kind of a sweet spot, especially if you're just getting started at doing image stacking, because it's not so many exposures that you're spending a lot of time on one particular composition. It's really easy to take 8 consecutive exposures, but 8 exposures is still a really good increase in the amount of data that we're collecting. So it'll actually make a really big difference in the amount of noise that we can reduce. So if we look at this before and after comparison, we can get a really good idea of what image stacking can do to our photograph. If we look really closely, we can see that the after image has a whole lot more detail and significantly less noise. So rather than just taking a single 20-second exposure for this composition, I ended up just waiting around about 3 minutes more to take 8 separate exposures. And by combining those exposures in post-processing, I was able to really increase the image quality and reduce the noise in the final image. So we're going to start by opening up one of our single exposures. And this image has already undergone my basic post-processing method for editing Milky Way photos. And if you haven't already seen that video, you can go ahead and check it out on my YouTube channel. Before I start, one of the things that I'm going to do is scroll down here to the noise reduction sliders, and I'm going to disable all of the color noise reduction. And one of the reasons that I'm going to do that is that Lightroom's color noise reduction, while it does a really good job, it ends up getting rid of a lot of the color that we might want in the image. Like for example, this pink nebula, this is the Lagoon Nebula, which is near the galactic center. And if I turn the color noise reduction on, we should expect that nebula to look pink. And once I turn the color noise reduction on, it no longer looks pink. So we're going to actually disable the color noise reduction for now. That we can rely on combining all of our separate exposures to actually reduce the noise instead. So once you've edited a single frame, we're going to want to apply all of those edits to all of our separate exposures. So we're going to go to the grid view by pressing G, and I'm going to select all of my exposures. Then I'm going to click the Sync Settings button, and I'm going to make sure that all of these checkboxes are checked, and I'm going to click Synchronize, and that'll apply the same exact edit to every single one of our photographs. So now that all of these photographs are synced, we can go ahead and open them up in Photoshop as layers. So I'm going to select all of them again, and I'm going to right click, and I'm going to choose Edit In and then Open as Layers in Photoshop. And the process of opening 8 separate layers in Photoshop usually takes a little bit of time, So this is a good time to sort of sit back and take a break. Okay, so now it looks like we have all 8 of our exposures loaded in Photoshop as layers, and the first thing that I like to do is select all of those layers, and I'm going to drag them down to this new layer button to copy all of the layers. And the reason that we're going to do that is we're going to make 2 separate stacks of images. The first stack is going to be of the foreground, just the details of the clouds down here and the trees, and then the second stack will be specific to the sky, where we'll align all of the images, and then we'll composite those together with a simple layer mask so we get the benefit of noise reduction in both the foreground and the sky. So with my layer copies selected, I'm going to go ahead and right click and choose Convert to Smart Object. And the process of converting to a smart object usually takes a couple of minutes. Okay, so now that we have our set of copied layers converted to a smart object, we're going to want to combine those layers with what we call a median filter. And a median filter is basically how we reduce noise. And to apply the median filter, we'll have to go to Layer, and then Smart Object, and then Stack Mode, and then choose Median. Now, one thing to note is that the Smart Object Stack Mode and the median filter is only available in Adobe Photoshop CS6 Extended or in the Adobe Photoshop CC version. If you don't have Photoshop CS6 Extended or Photoshop CC, check out this link to one of my other videos on Photon Collective of how to do an average stack without the use of the Smart Object stack modes. So with that Smart Object selected, I'll go ahead and select the median stack mode. So this is what the photograph looks like with the median stack applied, and as you can see, it ended up blurring the stars because the stars were moving between each of the exposures. So this particular stack is what we'll end up using for our foreground layer, and we'll do a separate stack for the sky specifically. Okay, so now that we have our foreground smart object filtered with the median filter, I'm going to go ahead and name that smart object to foreground. And we're done with this layer for now, so I'm going to go ahead and drag it all the way down to the bottom, and we'll start working on our other layers. So in my original video on landscape astrophotography stacking, I used the Photoshop Auto Align tool. And I'm going to walk through the same workflow that I used in that video just to show you what happens when the auto alignment feature fails. So normally when auto aligning, I'll select the top layer, and then I'll turn off all of the other layers by clicking on the eyeball icon to the left of each layer in the layers palette. And then I'll apply a layer mask to the top layer by clicking the Add Layer Mask button. And then I'll usually grab the paintbrush tool, and I'll use a relatively large brush, and I'll use black as the color, and I'll paint out the foreground. And the reason that we end up painting out the foreground is that we want Photoshop to just look at the stars and only align the stars to each other and not have any influence of any of the foreground objects. And once I have the layer mask finished on the first layer, I can go ahead and copy that layer mask to all of the other layers by holding down Command or Control and then Alternate, and then dragging the layer mask to the next layer. And then I can just repeat that for all of the consecutive layers. I'm just copying the layer mask to each of the other layers. And we'll skip the foreground layer. So now that we have the layer mask applied to all the separate layers, we can turn on all of the layers with the eyeball icon to the left of the layers. So when I'm approaching image stacking, I'll almost always use the auto alignment feature first, just to see if the auto alignment will work. Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. There's a lot of different factors that'll end up affecting the auto alignment tool. Things like clouds will end up messing it up. And if you're using a wide angle lens or a lens with a lot of distortion, that will sometimes also mess up the auto alignment tool. So in order to attempt the auto alignment, I'll select all the layers by using a shift click, and then I'll go to Edit and then Auto Align Layers. And I always tend to have the best success with the auto projection method. Depending on the lens that you're using, sometimes geometric distortion can help. If you're having trouble auto aligning, maybe try that out. But for this particular example, I'll use the auto projection method. Okay, so it looks like Photoshop finished its auto alignment tool. If we check each of these individual layers by turning them off and on, you can see that there's actually a little bit of movement between each layer still. So it seems like Photoshop didn't do a completely perfect job at aligning all of our layers. And so the problem that we end up encountering when the auto alignment function fails to work is that when we apply the median stack, we end up getting an image that looks like this. So we end up getting fairly good alignment on the galactic center, but if we look out at the corners of the image, the stars that fail to align end up getting smeared or blurred away, and that's really not the result that we want in our final image. So I'm going to step back to the point before we auto-aligned our images and before we created the layer masks. And so the best way to stack astrophotos that are having problems with auto alignment is to actually align them manually. And manual alignment kind of sounds a little bit difficult, but it's actually not that bad. We're only working with 8 exposures, and there's a pretty quick workflow for doing it. So the way that we're going to manually align each of these exposures is we'll start with the bottom layer, and the bottom layer will be sort of our reference layer. So I'm going to turn off all of the other layers. And this bottom layer is going to be the one layer that we align all of the other layers to. So I'll start by selecting the layer right above it, and I'll convert that layer's blending mode to difference mode. And what the difference blending mode does is it highlights where we have differences between each exposure, and that'll really help us make a better alignment of the stars. So the next thing that we're going to do is with the second layer selected, we're going to enter the free transform mode. And we can do that by pressing Command T, or we can go to Edit and then Free Transform. And once we're in Free Transform mode, you can see that we have this box, and then we also have this little center indicator. I usually like to zoom in onto the center indicator, and then I can use the arrow tool to just drag our top layer. And what I want to end up doing is aligning the stars around this center point. We want to try and get our alignment so that there's no halos around the star positions. If we're slightly off, we'll end up seeing some white, and so we just want to make the alignment so that none of that white color is visible. Then once we have the stars aligned in the very center of the image, we'll probably have to do a little bit of work to get the stars aligned on the corners of the image. And so if we place our cursor just outside the outer corner of the image, we can see that we end up getting this sort of double arrow rotation looking tool, and that'll allows us to click and drag to rotate the image, and we just want to rotate it so that we have as good of an alignment as possible. And as you can see, this star on the corner still has a little bit of white edge to it, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down Command or Control, and I should get a white arrow when I hover over the corner of the image here, and that allows me to skew the image. So I can click and drag, and we just want to drag it until we have most of the stars looking like dark spots. And if you're having trouble using the corner skew tool, you might have snap enabled, so you can disable that by going to View and then unchecking the snap function. Okay, so now that we have that top corner aligned, we can go ahead and check this other corner, and it looks like most of these stars are pretty well aligned. And then I'll go ahead and check the bottom corner, and it looks like there's a tiny bit of misalignment here, so I'm going to go ahead and skew this corner too. And remember that your alignment doesn't need to be completely perfect. We're going to use multiple exposures, and that'll help us sort of iron out some of the error in our alignment. And so now I'm going to move over to this corner, and the same thing, holding down Command or Control, I'm going to skew this corner until it appears that I have relatively good alignment. Alright, that looks pretty good. The way that I make the final corrections is I use the warp tool, and you can switch to the warp tool by clicking this icon up on the top toolbar, which is switch between free transform and warp modes. And when you click that, you'll end up getting this 3x3 grid, and what the warp tool lets us do is grab any point of the image, and if we drag it, we can warp the image. I'm going to undo that. So if I zoom in on some of the problematic areas, I can go ahead and click and drag until I have the stars perfectly aligned. And I can just go through each quadrant of the image to try and make sure that I have relatively good alignment. And it looks like this layer is pretty well aligned, so I'll switch the layers blending mode from difference back to normal, and then I can apply the transform and warp by pressing Command or Control and then Enter. And now if we turn on and off that layer, you can see that most of the motion that we have between the layers is just from the clouds moving. And the stars are pretty well aligned. There's barely any motion between the stars and the two layers. So now that that layer is aligned, we're ready to move on to the next layer. So we'll go ahead and turn off the layer that we just aligned. That way we're always aligning to the first layer so we don't end up propagating any errors between layers. So now we'll select the next layer that we want to align, and we'll go through the same steps. First step is to apply the difference blending mode, and then we can enter free transform mode with Command T or Control T, and we'll zoom in onto the center point, and then we'll click and drag and align our stars. And once we have relatively good alignment in the center of the image, we'll check our corners, and we'll start with a rotation. And then we'll skew the corners by holding down Command or Control and then dragging the corner until we have relatively good alignment in the corners. And we'll check each corner. And I'm just looking at the stars. We want to try and get most of the stars to disappear. And now that we have all four corners aligned, we should be able to switch to the warp mode. So with the warp tool enabled, I can go ahead and just fix some of my small errors in alignment. And it looks like this layer is pretty well aligned. So I'll go ahead and switch it back to the normal blending mode. And then we can apply our transform and warp by pressing Command and then Enter. And if we turn on and off this layer, we can see that we have relatively good alignment of the stars between this layer and the first layer. And I'm going to go ahead and quickly repeat the same procedure for all of the other layers. Okay, so now we have all of our layers aligned to our very first layer. So now that all of the layers are aligned, we can turn all of them on and then select all of the layers and combine them into a smart object. So after the layers are combined into a smart object, we can go to Layer, and then Smart Object, and Stack Mode, and Median. Okay, so now with the median filter applied, we can see how the stack reduced the noise in the image. If I disable that, you can see just how much of a difference that it made between the single exposure and the combination of the 8 exposures. It really adds a lot of detail and it gets rid of most of the noise. So this gives us like a pretty good master that we can then apply several more edits on in Adobe Lightroom. So one of the things to point out is since we aligned everything to the stars, we can see that the foreground is kind of a blurry mess. And that's where our original stack of the foreground comes in. So if I turn off that layer and turn on my original foreground layer, you can see that we have our sharp foreground, and we can combine that now with the sky stack that we just created. So to make things run a little bit faster, I'm going to go ahead and rasterize each of these layers. So I can right click the layer and choose rasterize layer. And I'll right click the foreground one and choose rasterize layer as well. And that just compresses the stack into a single layer so that Photoshop doesn't have to manipulate 8 layers all at once whenever we try to make a change. Since we ended up repositioning some of our layers for the alignment, you can see that we have some misalignment between our sky layer and our foreground layer. So I'm going to just do one last alignment using the difference blending mode. And this time I'm going to look at the tree line to align these two layers. And I'm just going to try and get them relatively close. They're not going to be a perfect match because of the image stack, but getting it relatively close will help us make our final composite. Okay, I'll switch back to normal blending mode. Okay, so now to finally combine our sky layer and our foreground layer, we'll be applying a layer mask to the sky layer by clicking the Add Layer Mask button and having the layer selected. And just like the procedure that we use with auto alignment, we'll be using the brush tool and black as the color, and we'll go ahead and just kind of roughly paint out the foreground to bring back our sharp foreground layer into view. And just to double check the layer, I'm going to use the Alt button and click on the layer mask and just clean up the details of the layer that I missed. And then I can click on the layer again to get my final image. Okay, so now that I have both of the layers combined using the layer mask, I can flatten the image by selecting this drop down on the top right of the layers palette and choosing flatten image. Okay, so I'll go ahead and save this image, and then we'll go back to Adobe Lightroom for the final edits. And now if we open this image in Adobe Lightroom, we can go ahead and enter the develop module by pressing D. And if you look closely, it still looks like we have a little bit of color noise, so we can bring back some of Lightroom's color noise reduction. I'm going to go ahead and bring it up just to the default of 25 that it typically uses. And you can see that that cleaned up the image pretty well. If we compare our final image with a single exposure, it gives us a really good before and after to show the results that image stacking is capable of. And so that's how I perform my exposure alignment when the auto align feature in Photoshop fails. Using multiple exposures to reduce noise is one of the techniques that I use in almost all of my images now. The post-processing can definitely be a little bit more time-consuming if you can't get your images to automatically align, but even so, the results are usually much better than if you're just using a single exposure, especially if you think the photograph is going to be one of your favorite compositions. Definitely take the extra 2 or 3 minutes to take several more exposures. You only need to take 8 exposures to do a stack like this, and the increase in image quality that you get is totally worth it. It ends up becoming a really good way to get a lot more image quality out of relatively limited gear. Like I mentioned, this photograph was actually taken with the Sony RX100III, which is a relatively small sensor camera. It only has a 1-inch sensor that's significantly smaller than the typical full-frame Sony A7 Mark II that I use. If you feel like your astrophotography is relatively limited by your gear, don't rush out and buy a new lens or buy a new camera. I highly recommend trying this method first. It can really make some huge improvements on what started as an extremely noisy astrophoto. So once again, my name is Ian Norman. If you want to see more astrophotography videos, please subscribe and check out all of our gear reviews, tutorials, and inspiration on lonelyspec.com. See ya!